No están solo. You are not alone. A chilly Los Angeles winter afternoon, a multi-faith group of clergy and lay people, Jews and Christians, documented and undocumented, black, white, Latinx, gathered on the steps of City Hall. It was the last night of Hanukkah, a few days before Christmas. Some of us were carrying the blue and white signs that Ben the Ark printed, which said, "All immigrants welcome here." Some of us carried the maroon signs that Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice had printed, said, "All religions demand justice," and others carried the red and white signs of Los Angeles Sacred Resistance. Following the structure of the Posada ritual, a Latin American pre-Christmas march in which participants performed Mary and Joseph's search for refuge, knocking on the door of the inn, asking to be let in, we marched to the office of the mayor of Los Angeles and demanded that he let immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers in. We then, 100 strong, marched across the street to the headquarters of the Los Angeles Police Department, and we delivered a letter to the chief of police demanding that the LAPD disentangle itself from immigration enforcement and that he let refugees and asylum seekers in. The sun was setting, and in front of LAPD headquarters, we lit a menorah to commemorate the last night of Hanukkah, to remember that the Hanukkah lights were lit on the border between inside and outside in order to push the light of hope into public spaces. And this night, we hoped that our Hanukkah candles would serve as symbolic beacons to guide those seeking refuge to our city as their sanctuary. We then marched as a group to the Metropolitan Detention Center, where ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, held undocumented immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, before they transferred them to other prisons or deported them. It was dark now. We stood in the driveway that ICE used for their buses, and we chanted, "No hate, no fear. Immigrants are welcome here." And we looked up and saw flickering of cigarette lighters, detainees showing us that they heard us. 50 yards away from us down the driveway, we saw groups of immigrants being loaded onto buses to be taken to the border or to other prisons. As each group was herded towards the bus, we chanted, "No están solos! You are not alone!" And standing with that group, people who themselves, some of them, because of their citizenship status, risked on a daily basis being put on one of those buses, I realized that No están solos was not just a chant. It was a prayer and a promise. The Midrash asks, why would God, who created the whole universe and rules it from on high, appear to Moses in a bush, a simple bush? The Midrash says that this was God performing the promise in the words of the psalmist, "Imo anochi b'tzara." I am with Israel in their time of need. When Israel was in Egypt, God was there with them. When Israel was in exile, God was with them. We are, all of us, created in the image of God. We act like God, however, when we act according to the logic of Imo anochi b'tzara. I am with him, with her, with you, with them in your time of trouble, in your narrow spaces. Mike Kinman, the rector of All Saints Church in Pasadena, who was there with us that day at the Metropolitan Detention Center, and thinking back on his experience, said, you can't do the work outside the blast zone. If you want to stand with people who are being marginalized, you have to stand with them. Hold on to that thought for a minute. There was once a righteous man who lived on page 7b of Tractate Bava Batra, the Babylonian Talmud, and lives there still. This man was so righteous that Elijah, the prophet, came to study with him. Now, that was no mean feat, because Elijah had been written out of existence centuries before the righteous man had been written into existence. But Elijah occupies a unique space in rabbinic culture, the culture of the rabbis who wrote the Talmud and its base text, the Mishnah. In 2 Kings chapter 2, where they narrate Elijah's moving on from this world, it said he went up to heaven in a whirlwind. It never says he died. And so the rabbis exploit this textual quirk to say that Elijah actually never died. He went up to heaven alive. And therefore he was available for special missions to come down to earth. And also why he could appear at your Passover Seder. One of those special missions, apparently, was studying with this man who lived on page 7b of Tractate Bava Batra. Now, Elijah and the righteous man had a chavruta, a study partnership, until one day the righteous man built a gatehouse outside the courtyard in which he lived. Elijah then no longer showed up for their study sessions. This perplexed the rabbis, because on that very same page of Talmud, in the Mishnah, we learned that not only is one allowed to build a gatehouse for their courtyard, but one can coerce and compel the other residents of the courtyard to contribute towards building the gatehouse. Now, if by law one can compel others to build a gatehouse, think of it like a condominium where the board can compel the residents to contribute money towards security by hiring a security guard or improving the alarm system. If, by law, you can compel the other residents of the courtyard to build a gatehouse, then a gatehouse must be a good thing. We wouldn't want to think that the rabbis were compelling poor public policy. So the rabbis were perplexed by the contradiction between the Mishnah and Elijah's behavior. So the rabbis do what Talmudic sages do. They distinguished and differentiated between the gatehouse of the Mishnah, which was a good gatehouse, and the gatehouse that the righteous man built, which was a bad gatehouse. The difference, it seems, is whether or not you can hear the cries of the poor. The commentators explain that if you build a gatehouse in such a way that when a poor person comes to ask for support, his voice can't carry over the gatehouse into the residents of the courtyard, then that is a bad gatehouse. And so Elijah disappeared. The righteous person had built a gatehouse in such a way that he could no longer hear the cries of the poor. This little piece of Talmudic wisdom has a history. Remember God appearing to Moses in the burning bush to perform the promise of Imo Anochi B'tzara, I will be with you in your narrow spaces? Well, that happened right after Israel cried out to God. Torah tells us that Israel cried out because of the harshness of their bondage to God, and their cries went up to God, and God heard them. And immediately God remembered the covenant with the ancestors, and then immediately waylaid Moses to see the burning bush and commissioned Moses to go and liberate the Jews from Egypt. It was God hearing the Israelites' cry that triggered redemption. On the other hand, when the Israelites cried out to Pharaoh because of the harshness of their bondage in which he himself had enslaved them, Pharaoh ignored them. Not only did he ignore them, but he harshened the working conditions. So God heard the cries of the Israelites, and it brought about redemption. Pharaoh ignored the cries of the Israelites, and it led ultimately to the destruction of Egypt. This is the background to the exhortation, you shall not wrong a stranger or oppress him, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not ill-treat a widow or an orphan, for if you do, I will heed their cries as soon as they cry out to me. My anger will blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword, and your wives will become widows and your children orphans. The lesson of the Israelite slavery in Egypt is that structures of power are neither static nor stable. What God is saying is that if you think you can ignore the cries of the powerless, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the enslaved, because you are powerful, then think again. Pharaoh was the sole ruler of Egypt, which was the most powerful nation on earth at that time. And because he ignored the cries of the powerless, of those he himself had enslaved, Egypt was totally destroyed. The message is that structures of oppression do not last forever. You're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. If you ignore the cries of the powerless, you are part of the problem. You are supporting the Pharaoh industrial complex. So this righteous person from page 7b in Bava Batra, whom Elijah left in the lurch after he built a gatehouse outside his courtyard, was not an evil person. I am sure that if he had run across a poor person on the street who asked him for food or money, he would have given him food or money. He was righteous. The problem was that he created his urban space such that he couldn't hear the cries of the poor. Living without a gatehouse means moving out of our comfort zone to be in proximity with other people. Being in proximity with other people means being able to hear their pain and respond to their need. Systems of oppression demand the passive cooperation of all of us. There are cultural narratives that motivate us to want to retreat into our silos, our neighborhoods, behind our gatehouses, in order not to be able to hear the cries of other people, people of other races, other religions, other sexualities, other citizenship statuses. The way we interrupt those narratives is by coming face to face with other people. Immanuel Levinas, French-Jewish philosopher of the 20th century, wrote that on the face of the other person is written, "Thou shalt not kill." Now, we all know that the history of the 20th century was written by those who abrogated that very commandment in the most awful and atrocious ways. What Levinas was saying, and Levinas was born in Lithuania in 1906 and he died in Paris in 1995, and so he lived out that whole tragic arc of history. What Levinas was saying is that if I look into your face, the vulnerability of your face, into the opening of your face, into what you are as a person, if I really do that, I immediately realize that I can never grasp you. I can never totally understand who you are, and therefore, I have no right to use you or abuse you. All I can do is respond to your need. If we live in proximity to other people, we can't paint them with the broad brush of pre-existent prejudice. We can only see them as human beings created in the image of God. We also have to redefine what we mean by us and them. If we think of the world in terms of it's hard to think of the world in terms of us and them if we think in terms of two people connecting face to face and really hearing and seeing each other. And if we keep these face-to-face encounters in the center of our consciousness as we grow these encounters into alliances, we will always remember that other groups, Muslims, African Americans, Latinx people, trans people, undocumented people, Jews of color, Ashkenazi Jews, are human beings. There is no us and them. There's just all of us. And then I can recognize that your well-being is my obligation, and my well-being is your obligation. We know what happened when we didn't see and hear each other. During World War II, when the French Vichy government wanted to deport the Jews to the camps, they loaded them on buses and they wended their way through the streets of Paris, and nobody stopped them. When Japanese Americans were put in concentration camps, they were loaded on buses and they wended their way through the streets of Los Angeles, and nobody stopped them. And so Elijah went away. And so, on another afternoon, in front of that same Metropolitan Detention Center, on Pesach, a few days before Easter, 300 people gathered and told their Jewish and Muslim and Christian and Sikh stories of liberation. And then we sat down in the driveway that ICE uses for their buses. And when we were ordered to leave, we refused to do so. And so 30 people were arrested that day. Rabbis, imams, priests, ministers, Jews, Christians, Muslims, black and brown and white. What we were trying to say, however imperfectly, was that we would not allow buses loaded with undocumented immigrants headed for the border to drive through the streets of our city unencumbered. No están solos. Your well-being is my obligation. My well-being is your obligation.